everybody. You're listening to and watching the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Bill Zanowitz.
And I'm Steve Morey.
And we are your hairy, heavy homos that talk about comic books, but you don't have to be a hairy, heavy homo to listen in, or in this case, stream in. And I got to tell you, Steve, that intro music that we get through the service that we use to do the live stream, it's ingrained in my head. And I really toyed with the idea of including it in the last edit for the last audio episode, just because it would have been easier than doing the battles track.
Hey, it's public domain, so
yeah. Like I just like in my. I just wonder if like I'm waking up from a dream and that like did he like that's playing immediately before I wake up, you know? It's
if you hear
it's
that
so ingrained right now.
And you see floating numbers counting down from 30.
Mm-hmm.
You might still be dreaming.
You might be.
Either that or you're sleeping way too close to the alarm clock.
So how you doing?
Look, I'm doing pretty good. It's been a long week. It's end of the month week for for work stuff. So I'm sure everybody's kind of going.
Oh my God, this week has been so long. Oh Lord.
Yeah.
Lord. But we just had the heavens open up over here. So hoping that there is no disruption of power so that we can continue to talk. By the sounds of the frogs, it's clear that the rain is over, but we're still under. I think we still have about 25 minutes left or so under a tornado watch. So we'll say, things start spinning, you'll know what's happening.
If the house begins to twitch. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, so just to give us some background about what we're doing tonight, one of us is a bit behind on his reading. So, let me show you my reading. Let me show you. This is my DC pile. This is it. I still got to get through this before the next DCBS box hits, which is probably going to be in a couple days. So, I'm hoping I don't have too much to do this weekend. I'd really love to mainline this stuff, but I haven't read this, so I can't talk about much new. So we decided we are going to do an episode about the first graphic novels and collected editions that we ever read and enjoyed. And when I posted this on my page today, I saw like a bunch of really interesting and enlightening reactions, with people submitting what theirs were. So maybe while we're doing that, we can also sprinkle in some of that stuff. So in terms of geek gets, did you get anything cool this week, Steve?
Oh God, absolutely not. But I did do a kind of geeky thing. I did see a couple movies.
Okay.
Not that I would necessarily recommend. I mean, it's like getting culture of a sort.
But
but I did see
keep in mind where you live and being cinema safe. Please keep that
exactly.
in mind, everybody.
Everybody in different parts of the country may have different experiences, but down here the movie theaters are fully open. They are, I guess, technically at full capacity, but they're usually empty when I go see them, see anything in them. So I did see Snake Eyes, which I guess if I were a bigger G.I. Joe fan, I either would have loved it or hated it for ruining my childhood. And since I'm neither a big fan or a small fan, I enjoyed it for the action movie it was, although it was okay. And then I did see the latest M. Night Shyamalan, which I don't want to spoil it for you, but there is a twist.
Oh, really? That's unheard of in one of his films.
I know, it's shocking. It is definitely a little bit more on the enjoyable side of his films. This one's definitely got a very more much more tightly packed cast. Very, very interesting, although as usual with his movies, dialogue's kind of choppy and iffy, but it was an interesting watch, and if you're a fan of his movies, I'd recommend checking it out. But that's pretty much it, because I've been kind of more or less stuck at home all week.
All right. Well, you did not mention the name of that film, and that film is named Old. Just want to put that out there. So I did get some geeky stuff over the week. Last week I mentioned that the store Vintage Vinyl is going out of business because of the retirement of the two owners, and I ended up making another trip. So my final trip turned out to be a penultimate trip, and this turned out to be my final trip because tomorrow it's seriously closing. It's all. So I got a bunch of things. Not going to go through everything, but I thought this was the most geeky one. And a couple of years ago, I'm sorry, I'm like getting reflections because I haven't opened it yet. This is the Krypton soundtrack on vinyl, which was a record store day entry, I think, in 2019. Yep. And they still had some copies, and I don't want to tell you how much I got this for because it's like insanely low. But
was it a steal?
It was basically it was very cheap. And this is on limited edition red orange Galaxy vinyl. So here we go. And I know, Steve, you have ordered from Hamilton Books in the past, and every so often I check what's going on, and I ended up getting a substantial discount, and this thing is so weird and heavy. This is the DC Comics variant covers, the complete visual history. Has a 2018 copyright date, and again, just like the Krypton, still unopened. I almost sprained my hand holding this up for a picture before, but substantially discounted. Don't know how complete it is now, since it's at this point over 3 years old, but interested in opening that and seeing. You see some of the variant covers. I wonder how far it goes back. I'm hoping it does go far back as Man of Steel #1 in 1986, which was DC's first variant. Toy wise, I did get a new Mego. And this is Ultraman from Ultra 7. I'm not sure. I do think Mego has two variations of Ultraman, one from the Ultraman series and one from Ultra 7. I'm not exactly sure. But like Rocketeer, it's something I never thought I'd be buying at retail. So got that. And I did go bin diving, and that led me to getting almost all of Airboy from Eclipse in the 1980s. So at some point I'll read this. At some point,
goes to the bottom of the stack.
Yeah, it also put me down a rabbit hole, and it just felt very upsetting. And these books were written by Chuck Dixon, and Chuck Dixon fell down a very big QAnon rabbit hole himself, and that's sad to see, because I always enjoyed his work as a writer, knowing full well he was ultra conservative, but he seems to have gone down a path that you just can't endorse. And hanging out with Vox Day, that's a bit much. So a bit sad on that. But anyway, before we get to the graphic novel and collected edition discussion, we actually did have San Diego Comic-Con news, because that actually did take place over last weekend. Didn't seem to be a lot of fanfare for it, maybe because there is an in-person edition over Thanksgiving weekend. I'm still processing that. But
as is most people.
Yeah, so you did collect some of the news bits, so why don't you tell us some of the stuff that went down there?
I did. Well, first, we do have a couple people who have chimed in. We've got John Runyon. I'm on time for class tonight. Comic book Carousology.
Hey,
hello, John. We also have Tony Gilkinson. Tornado
Hey,
Thursday.
Tony.
Hey, guys.
Tornado. I like that.
Tornado Thursday. Blue Steel is making an appearance. Really interesting.
Yeah, you know what Blue Steel is, right? Oh,
the facial expression.
Remember my eyes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Well, hey, so yeah, like you mentioned, there wasn't a lot of fanfare with San Diego Comic-Con this year, pretty similar to last year, but I think this year is even more subdued because there were no DC movies and there were no real, well, take that back, Suicide Squad did promote a little bit, but no major announcements from DC.
Not
Comics
like they did in London.
Yeah, exactly. Giant star.
So just Google that.
Yes, I mean, I didn't think I would ever see something like that ever. But yeah, I mean, movie news from Marvel, from the MCU, not really much there that we didn't already know, and obviously they didn't really bring a lot of panels. there's no equivalent of Hall H this year for anything like that. But we did have in comics news, we did have some more information, some more promotion of the Trial of Magneto, which is the next big X-Men event, limited series that's coming up starting, I believe, in August. So, very, very quickly coming up. And that, of course, is if you've been reading along or have been listening to the show, we did talk about what happened towards the end of the Hellfire Gala, and spoiler, Scarlet Witch appears to have been murdered, and there's a possibility, clearly, hence the title Trial of Magneto, that Magneto was responsible for her death. So we'll be seeing how everything kind of plays into that. Obviously, that does unfortunately mean that a couple other series are ending. So Way of X, X Factor are unfortunately ending. Cable is, of course, ending, but we knew about that for a while. But this will hopefully lead us into the next stages of the X-Men Krakoan saga that's been going on for the past couple of years. And then on the DC side, really the big crossover announcement was more or less Batman's Fear State, which, of course, when you bring up Fear, you gotta have Scarecrow. And this one is going to be going through all of the Bat Family books currently published by DC as part of the ongoing series. And that should lead us into 2022. But again, those are pretty much the biggest comic announcements that we really got. Now, we did have some interest. I mean, I'm a big Whovian. I know Brian's a huge Whovian. Maybe not comic news, but a little bit more news about season 13, which is going to be the last season for this particular Doctor before it, of course, Doctors regenerate, and we're going to get a new Doctor at some point, but not until probably late next year. So, but season 13 is coming. They released a teaser trailer for that, really heavily promoting that. And then also on one of our favorite shows, DC shows on TV, Legends of Tomorrow, that bizarre, insane ride every week that we get from them. Things are going to continue to be wacky. John Constantine is leaving the show, but Matt Ryan is staying. So John Constantine may not be there, but Matt Ryan will be playing another character, an early 20th century. I guess he's an archaeologist, doctor, psychologist, something, some kind of smarty pants. But his name is leading you to believe that he is going to be, Gwen is his name, by the way, is leading to believe that he will be Welsh, which Matt Ryan actually is Welsh, so we may actually get to hear his real accent, not the kind of Cockney that he puts on as John Constantine, and definitely not an American accent. So it'd be nice to hear him actually sound like himself.
Yeah, and maybe we'll also see his actual brunette hair.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. He's been dyeing blonde for since 2015. I think that was the original NBC series.
Something, yeah, I think it was about that. Yeah.
So, but yeah, we'll get to see his brown hair as well, which, hopefully some shirtless scenes too. I don't know. I have a little crush on him. But anyway, and then we also
did see mentions that Vandal Savage was once again going to be the season big bad, yet no mention that Casper Crump, or I think that's his name.
Casper Crump.
I don't think they mentioned that it would necessarily be him playing the character.
Exactly. So it might be a new multiversal explanation for how Vandal Savage looks, or maybe he had some plastic surgery, or
and also what you seem to be very excited about, an actress who's already part of the cast, sort of joining the cast in a new capacity. Yeah,
she's been there since day one. But Amy Louise Pemberton, she has been the voice of Gideon since The Flash. First premiered the Gideon in season 1 of that show, but she actually did make a in the flesh sort of appearance at the end of, I believe it was season 3 or 4, season 4, I think it was, where she appeared to Tali and helped her out with some situation that was going on in the ship. But she will be joining the cast as a walking around actress, which would be kind of interesting.
Yeah,
to see how she interacts in person.
And with the wrangling, I think they did leave it so that Dominic Purcell will be recurring I believe he is
Mhm.
making some appearances in the next season. It already started filming.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it seems like it's moving pretty quickly, but then again, we are 2 days away from August as
Yeah.
we're doing this, so it's
Mhm.
we're almost through 3/4 of the year so far. So
Mhm.
pretty soon, 2022 will be in, and season 7 of
Mhm.
Legends of Tomorrow, and several other shows. So, but yeah, those were the big highlights that really
Mhm.
tickled me.
Yeah.
Um,
I've been meaning to watch some of the Comic-Con at home stuff. The only one I've gone through was the Marvel X-Men panel.
oh, yeah, actually,
Yeah,
David Toby just said something very interesting.
yeah.
Marina Baccarin played Gideon on The Flash for maybe in the first season, I bet, but Amy Pemberton's been there since before DC Legends. You know what? It might have been a bit
Maybe.
in the first season. Could
Oh,
be.
could
Eh.
be.
I
I
mean,
don't know.
with a voice and the fact that it's been like a weirdo,
Yeah,
CGI head for such a long time, it's very
yeah.
comfortable there.
And
Cool.
since you
Thank
mentioned
you.
David Toby, we should also mention some of the other people that have joined us. John Westhoff is
Yeah,
here. Anthony
yeah.
Comito is
Also got
here. Vince Tenebra is
Jack.
here. Yeah.
Yeah, Jack Foster. Hi,
Hey,
boys. He
Jack.
says.
Fan favorite, Jack Foster.
And favorite Jack Foster, John
Yeah.
Westhoff, of course, with the double horns there. So, and of course, David Toby. Thank you, David, for joining. But yeah, yeah. I mean, not a lot. Like you said, you were saying about X-Men.
Hmm.
I mean, that's kind of the biggest news that I got from Marvel.
Yeah. But it was some panel that had, some of the writers, Vita, Leah,
Teeny Howard, I think,
Teeny Howard,
was the speaker of that. Yeah.
mm, 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 and, but definitely Ben Piercy and Jerry Duggan were part of that,
Yeah.
and that annoying editor that they have. So did I say that? Um, the one with the ukulele, I forget his name.
Jordan.
Jordan,
White.
yeah, just a bit much. Okay, but anyway, so I guess we should start talking about graphic novels and collected editions. So,
I guess.
well, we all have a very different experience with them. For some people, it's their entry point into comics. For other people, they followed the medium to the point where they became a norm where they previously weren't. So you can see here that with the hair that I'm a sprightly 21 years old, and way
Young
back
buck.
in my past life, in the Christmas of 1973, when I was 6 years old in my past life, as Tim Zanowitz, um, I was really happy that my parents recognized that I was really going head over heels for comics. I was really happy that they recognized that. And there weren't a lot of prestige books at the time. There weren't a lot of hardcovers or even paperbacks for that matter that reprinted comic material. And my parents seemed to find somehow 3 of the 4 that were in print at the time. So I have, for 2 of the 3, I have my original copies. And again, these were all in the Christmas of 1973, and these were technically my first collected editions. You might have to. I know I sent you some pictures before. This is my original copy, and I talked on the show before about this. This was Jules Pfeiffer's The Great Comic Book Heroes. So held together by tape, you know, because the first person that held this was a 6-year-old, and this came out initially in 1965, and it really was the first volume that I'm pretty sure it's the first hardcover printing in North America of comic material. Maybe there were some comic strip stuff, but at least in terms of comic books, it certainly was the first. And it starts off with a preamble talking about the comics industry and the history of heroes in comics, and then reprinted stories from the Golden Age. So this was the first. I have a really cool thing here. I have a 1973 Wonder Woman sticker. Somehow I put that back in there, so that survived all these years. But again,
Gorgeous.
these were all gifts from the first Christmas. This is a replacement copy. At the time, Crown Books had a license with DC Comics, and they had hardcovers of Superman from the 30s to the 70s, which literally printed stories from the 30s to the 70s, both in color and in black and white. And one of the coolest things for somebody who was a new comic book reader at the time is they also reprinted some covers. And this, I never saw this stuff before as a little kid, seeing covers from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. It was just what was on the rack at the time. So this blew my mind, my little baby 6-year-old mind. So this is a replacement copy, but I do have my original of Batman. You can see Batman here from the 30s to the 70s. And again, it's the same format there. Again, cover galleries. And with the Batman stuff, there seemed to be a lot of Batwoman and Batgirl stuff from the late 50s, early 60s. For some reason, there's a predominance of that in the middle section, but it did go up to which was just a few years prior to work by Irv Novick and Neil Adams there. So certainly first time I experienced the post-TV Batman when the character in the comics got gradually seriouser, more serious.
More and more serious.
Yeah, but I always will, give a salute to my parents for recognizing that, this was something that was really affecting me. And, these were great gifts to have under the tree, that first Christmas, the first comic book Christmas. And I just have a lot of fond memories of, just reading and rereading the stuff. And obviously you can tell by the condition that two of them are in that, they were well loved. And I'm really glad I still have two of the three. The original Superman, I mean, that just fell apart in my hands. I reread that so many times.
Yeah.
But
I'll actually see. I do have copies of the images. Let me see if I can actually.
Yeah, because they're both great covers for the ones that you didn't see. If you can pull them up.
Let me see.
Should I work like some magic? There we go. Yep,
there
that's
we go.
The Great Comic Book Heroes by Jules Pfeiffer.
Yep.
And again, Jules Pfeiffer is a very noted playwright and author and columnist and everything. So, and he's still with us. He's still with us.
Really?
He's in his late 90s, but he's still with us. Yeah.
And let's see if I can pull up the Batman one, because that one actually is pretty cool as well. I thought that was kind of interesting. Here we go. Yeah, Batman with Robin the Boy Wonder. From the 30s to the 70s.
And that's a Carmen Infantino art.
Mm-hmm.
And that was originally done as a poster in the 60s.
Really? And then they just made it. They just made it
the cover. Yeah. But there were a series of posts of like hard cardboard posters. I had them actually. Somehow I had them in the mid 70s. They were still around. Wish I still had them. No. Disintegrated in a youngster's hands. It just happens.
Well, I mean, and I think like people who have those early memories of like certain toys, obviously, and comic book collections, things like that, where before they realized that they could take care of them in a way, that there were ways to preserve them. When you're 5, 6, 7 years old, you're not usually thinking about these things. You want to actually enjoy what you're reading or what you're playing with. Obviously 20, 30, 40, 50, 60-year-old us's are thinking, what the hell, kid? You should take care of this, so I still have it, or if it's still in mint condition, or it's still in its box. But the thing is, when you're a kid, it is your job to love something and to really, do everything you can to enjoy it. I mean, it's yours to enjoy.
This wasn't one of the earliest ones, but this will give you an idea. This was a book from the mid-70s, Secret Origins of the Super DC Heroes, the fantastic Neil Adam's cover, and what do you know? Tape holding it together.
Tape. I mean, it's something that we turn our noses up when we see it in a, in a cheap 4 for $1 box, or, like in a collection of stuff somebody pulled out of their attics. But you know what? When it's ours, we're going to keep it if we can, and keep it in whatever condition we can because of the sentimental value. And that's really where, a lot of this comes in.
Yeah.
I had one thing when I was about 5-6 years old, and it wasn't mine. It was something that I was able to enjoy going over to my grandparents, to visit on, every week or every other week or so. And it was the Peanuts Treasury collection that they had from 1968 that just collected all of these Peanuts strips, all the daily and the Sunday strips. And, I would read that thing cover to cover, mostly because, if I was visiting, I was like the only kids sometimes, and let the adults hang out and talk. And all.
Were you an early reader? I was a very early reader. I was like, at 4 years old I was reading.
My parents basically like to say, as soon as I learned how to read myself, then my nose was never out of a book ever. I would just read and reread everything that I had, and then read everything else that I could find. So so if there was a book to be read, I was most likely reading it.
Right. And I think it's important that you had mentioned the Peanuts Treasury. When we were talking about this earlier, there was a baseball themed hardcover for Peanuts called Sandlot Peanuts, and that was it's over there. No dust jacket, again in the hands of 9-10-year-old. But I do think the comic strip was a bit better represented in these forms for a long time in collections. And, whether it's as a transition to comic books later, there's definitely a part to be played by those books. And I think, for many people, we're of different ages. For me, it was, clearly Peanuts. For you had mentioned Garfield, the books through Scholastic. I know for many other people, whether it's Bloom County or Calvin and Hobbes, especially, or
Calvin and Hobbes, Far Side.
Far Side. I do think that very often something that's within the ambit of the collected editions may be something along the lines of comic strips, and you do see that.
Yeah, and I think that's that is a pretty important distinction that everybody kind of makes nowadays. Is like, is it a comic book? Is it a graphic novel? Is it a trade? Thinking about comics traditionally, but for a long time, comic strips kind of were a way to introduce a lot of people. If you didn't have access to a comic shop, or heck, everybody who still had newspapers, I mean, there was something that came to your house every day that had an entire page, sometimes 2 pages of comics for you to read.
And I do think in terms of literature, they were far more respected for a long time, at least in North America. I can't talk about Europe, because I think Europe's always had a bit of a different appreciation. In some ways, we're far more progressive in terms of acceptance, and also not just Europe, Japan as well. So
with the actual separate, this is a book that is only comics, and that is it's what I'm reading on purpose. But and actually to continue with that, I'll talk about one of mine. This is not the first, I would say the first graphic novel or trade that I ever got. And like you had mentioned, Garfield, I had been buying all those Garfield Treasury editions through the Scholastic Reader insert at school, in elementary school. But I believe I was going into 6th grade, so back, I guess that was like 1991. So I was 10 going on 11. There was a little show that had just started becoming really popular on TV. It's called The Simpsons. And The Simpsons was created by, among other people, Mack Renning, who first started showing the animated family in little shorts on the Tracy Ullman Show on Fox. And then it graduated to its actual own half-hour animated series. And at the time that it blew up, interest in Mack Renning stuff, his previous stuff before The Simpsons started becoming really big, and I thought it was really interesting. I was looking for stuff that was related to some of his original creations, and so I came across this at a Walden Books, if anybody remembers what a Walden Books was. And this is called The Big Book of Hell, a cartoon book by Mack Renning. Now, it is a collection of newspaper strips. These are full-page strips that he did for the LA area Reader magazine through the 80s. And then, of course, it kind of grew from there and started being published in a lot of newspapers, mostly city newspapers, some I would say more premium style newspapers, not so much the daily, like, let's read this comic strip Mary Worth kind of thing, because of course it was a lot more adult. So this was not for kids. So for like a 10, 11-year-old, thinking that they'd stumbled upon some really, great kid stuff, this was not that. And of course I was extremely happy for it because, they swore, they talk about sex. It is wonderful. But basically it's about his strip that he started way back in 1978, became a regular weekly strip, I think in the 80s, early 80s. And this collects most of those comics from 80 to about 88, about, featuring Binky, who is a sort of a numpty of a rabbit who suffered through his menial, mindless job and his crappy life, and all the players around him. His illegitimate son Bongo, who was a rabbit with one ear for some reason. His sometimes on again, off again girlfriend Sheba, and Akbar and Jeff. Two very short, very nondescript little men in fezzes who were gay, very clearly gay. And I think at some point there was some controversy over whether they were or not. I mean, Mack Renning didn't even have to phone it in. I mean, there's one great strip where Akbar and Jeff look at each other and say, let's go to a gay bar. We haven't been ever. We need to go to a gay bar. I don't know if we'll fit in. And they show up, and every single person, it's an entire room filled with Akbars and Jeffs that all look like them. And it's like, yes, of course, this is a gay bar. We're finally home. It's like, this is what it is. It's hilarious. It's fun. It's, just a great commentary on life. And, to have a collection like this, and you can tell this has been around. It's got, what looks like pieces torn out of it. It's, not falling apart, but it is, if I pull the spine too much, it will fall apart. But loved it. And that was like one of my first, I would say, more adult, more indie collections of comics that I had read. Probably the first of like the very indie comics that I read. Really enjoyed it, loved it. And, of course you can get all sorts of other, Love is Hell, School is Hell, all the themed books with collections. But the Big Book of Hell was my big introduction to not just what Mack Renning used to do, but also indie comics and comics with an X. It's a simple, easy foray into the much wider world from there.
Okay, cool. Now, I know some people have been commenting about what their first ones were. So if you want to capture some of those while you're doing that and prepping that, I'll go over what people said on my feed were some of the first.
Excellent.
Yeah, so let me go through here. I'm not going to attribute unless it's somebody I know is watching. So, so The Essential Howard the Duck, Why I Hate Saturn by Kyle Baker. This is from John Westhoff, who I attributed the new term floppy snobby to because he was mostly a singles reader, but he thinks it may have been something like Powers. Okay. Legion of Superheroes Archives. That's interesting.
Yeah.
The Dark Knight Returns, Elf Quest, which was collected very early on from the single issues. The collected Sam and Max, All-Star Superman, Identity Crisis, Justice League: A New Beginning, X-Men Asgardian Wars, very early collected editions from the late 80s. let's see here. The Origins of Marvel Comics. Those were put out by Fireside in the 70s, and it was like an annual thing. There was Origins, Son of Origins, Bring on the Bad Guys, Team Superhero Women. I have all of them over there. They're over there.
Of course.
Only one replacement. Most of the originals there. A friend of mine who is from Greece said there wasn't much that they could get, but he did get collections on the Freak Brothers and Hellboy.
Nice.
The New Mutants graphic novel, the original graphic novel that was part of Marvel's series that started with the death of Captain Marvel. Peanut strips, Mad paperbacks. Seeing those there. Mouse. Why the Last Man, Kingdom Come. Let's see here. The Uncanny X-Men, the Phoenix issues that were reprinted just before the collected editions became a craze, I think in 83 or 84.
Yeah.
Let's see. The graphic novel version of the Dick Tracy movie. The first time this is here, Watchmen. There we go. Let's see.
Well, as somebody's like first trade,
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty. I mean, if somebody wasn't into comics, like nowadays, it's on a lot of New York Times and must-read lists, so it could very well be a lot of people's first graphic novel.
So we have more of the Origin series from Marvel. Batman Digital Justice, which was one of the first, the earliest computer art books. The first, I think, was Shatter that came out from First, but that was like single issues. The Death of Superman, up until a few years ago when Watchmen got a big kick from the trailer, that was the highest selling graphic novel in the States for a long time. Vince, who's on the call, who's watching, that I shouldn't surprise us that it's Dark Horse Comics Alien collection. He's really into that stuff. X-Men God Loves, Man Kills, another
classic.
The Books of Magic, Buck Rogers collection, Lobo's Greatest Hits, and Batman Death in the Family. Yeah, so really
all good and
interesting and very wide spread of choices there.
Well, definitely. And, from some of the people who have joined us here, we got John Runyon mentioning Calvin and Hobbes for the win. And Bazooka Joe. This is actually very interesting. I know it's not necessarily a real collection here.
But taping them into a notebook in numbered order.
Notebook in numbered order. There you go. Making your own trade collection of Bazooka Joe comics.
I did that. There was a point as a little kid I was really into Dondi, that comic strip, and I had a notebook and I taped them in.
I did the same thing with the Amazing Spider-Man newspaper strips.
Cool.
I did that. I actually had I had one of those marble composition notebooks, and I would cut out the Amazing Spider-Man and put it in there. I don't know what happened to that. It's probably long thrown away. Tony Gilkinson here, his first graphic novel was the 1982 Marvel graphic novel number 4, The New Mutants, Chris Claremont and Bob McLeod. I think you mentioned that as well. James Figueredo has joined us, and
hey, James.
And his was God Loves, Man Kills. Made a hell of an impression on him, and I'm sure it made an impression on a lot of people, especially if that was the first big introduction to the X-Men as well. I mean, that's pretty heavy social stuff. And then we've got David as well. Batwoman Elegy was his, and that's a more recent one, but it's definitely a great one.
Very good entry point for sure.
Yeah. Anthony Comito, Books of Magic, and of course he also has a large collection of Peanuts books as well. Good old Charles Schultz. They start collecting his stuff. I mean, since the 60s, I guess. And
they will be collecting his stuff. We will be dust, and they will still be collecting it into the year 3027 one or whatever.
Fantagraphics, their Treasury editions are absolutely gorgeous. If you haven't had a chance to at least check them out, if you haven't bought them yourself, They're
over
really
there
great.
too.
Yeah,
Just a few of
beautiful
them. I
library
just
edition.
have a few of them. Yeah. And
Yeah.
also, in terms of that, if you are looking for publishers that do this stuff with the comic strip stuff, IDW's library
Mhm.
of comic strips is amazing.
Oh
Fantagraphics
yeah.
has done great stuff. And for some of the more esoteric stuff, there's a publisher, Hermes Press, has done an amazing job on the Buck Rogers series,
Mm.
and the Phantom and other strips. So those publishers are out there. But I just want to kind of take a dive off from some of the books that people had mentioned, like X-Men, God Kills, Man Loves, God Loves, Man Kills, and and the New Mutants, and that's the concept of the original graphic novel. And
Mhm.
the first one that I ever read, because again, they were a rarity. They were, far more prevalent in Europe, and sometimes you would get reprints from Europe from smaller publishers. I'm about to cough, so let me go on mute. Hope y'all didn't hear
Cough,
that.
cough, cough.
Yep. But the first one that kind of fits that description for me was The Silver Surfer, by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. This was actually created as a treatment for a possible film. And this character, I think her name's Nova. I
Yeah,
forget.
that would
Yeah.
be Nova. She took over after Silver Surfer's
No, no,
economic.
no. This is the only time she's appeared. Um, let me
Who was
see.
the?
Let me see what her
Well, I
name
mean, that's a very
is.
stylized, side of
Ardina.
a band. Adina.
Ardina, and this was again in some ways a treatment for a film with Olivia Newton-John as Adina, and it really is the last true collaboration between Jack and Stan. And I
Mm.
love this story. I love this story. It's basically takes the whole concept of the Silver Surfer coming to Earth, um, you know, being affected by the people that he meets, and disregarding his role as the Herald, and
Mm.
challenging Galactus not to eat us. All right.
Which,
Okay.
which seems to be a frequent need.
Yeah. But it's some of Kirby's best artwork from that period. This is a Earl Norham painted over Jack's pencils here, and it's just so beautiful. This cover, and this is not my original copy. Again, over there, my original copy is a bit more beat up. I got this a few years ago at a garage sale, and you had mentioned Walden Books, and look, it's got the B. Dalton sticker
Yep.
from the remainder
Also,
there. Yep.
which one was the mall one? Was it Walden Books that was the mall one, and B. Dalton was the standalone, or was it vice versa? I can't remember anymore.
I don't know, because I also think it depends what market you were in.
Probably.
Because they all started as standalone stores, where
Yeah.
I was. Also, there was a store, Brentano's,
I
which
remember
eventually
Brentano's. Yeah.
became a chain. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
so this was the earliest book that kind of fit the description of an original graphic novel for me.
Mm.
And I was really happy to come across a nicer copy than the one that I had and still have. Ain't going nowhere. Got my issues, sentimentality. But that's the one for me. I also wanted to, if you could put up a picture, Steve, of one that I think probably was a big one for many people, and that was the adaptation of Alien that came out from Heavy Metal Publishers, that were written by Archie Goodwin with art by Walter Simonson. This was a really big book, and if you see the format, it very much was later aped by the Marvel series of graphic novels, and DC eventually got into the game a little bit later. Don't know if you have that handy, but that was one I also wanted to mention. That was a very early one, and
Nope, that's
uh,
the wrong one.
nope. Uh, but with that particular book, it was prepared well in advance of the film, because of release schedules and stuff. So there's scenes in that book that do not take place in the film, and they're really
There we
gross.
go.
But this is
Yeah.
this is a great, great book, and there have been reissues of it over time, and I think there's an artist edition from
Mhm.
IDW, which takes the original pencils. Yep.
So this is interesting because this kind of reminds me very much of sort of a this is not the font. This isn't the image that I would associate with Alien.
Mhm.
So it doesn't seem to have that same kind of design work to it, which kind of reminds me a little bit of Marvel's version of Star Wars, which again was very much an interpretation
Mhm.
of what they were reading from George Lucas. And I'm wondering, I don't know if you know a lot about the background on this heavy metal edition, if it was something that was commissioned by 20th Century Fox around the time that the movie was being promoted, or
Oh, it was
prior
well
to its
before
release.
it came out. It came out in tandem with the film.
Oh yeah, so it
Yeah,
would have been
yeah,
probably before anybody there had actually
yeah.
seen the
But also,
final
like
product.
Star Wars, they were working from the script, and not everything that was shot ended up in the film. So in the
Mhm.
Star Wars adaptation from Marvel, you have Biggs Darklighter, and you
Yeah.
have a confrontation with Jabba the Hutt. That
Mhm.
weren't in the original film. So very much a similar situation where there are other characters, and it's gross what happens. You just have to Google it and you find out. Um,
Well,
but I
I
think
mean,
that was a
there's some things.
very important one because that was a very big seller. That
Yeah.
particular book.
Well, we have a couple more comments here.
Yep. Okay.
Omar Kazarski mentioned
Hey,
that his
Omar.
first was probably Death of Captain
Captain
Marvel, and
Marvel.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
that
Just
was
as
a
I
big
said.
one
Yeah.
too. And then Tony Gilkinson actually says again, Leonard and Larry collected editions. Now, I'm not familiar with Leonard and Larry. What would
No,
that
not.
have been?
Yeah. We'll have
Um,
to look into that.
yeah, we'll
We'll
have to
take
take
that
a look
under
at that.
advisement. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the information, Tony.
Perhaps Rebecca could help us with
Rebecca,
that.
Rebecca, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's and Vincent comment to the font that was
Mm,
used on the heavy metal Alien book was the font is very
yeah.
representative of
And
early publicity
Vince
posters.
would know. Let
Yeah,
me tell you
until the
that.
settle on the actual
Vince
movie
would
poster.
know. So,
Because yeah, I mean
yeah.
the final font and the final what we see as Alien,
Hmm.
or what we grew up on the VHS covers of Alien in the 80s. That's it's very unique, very
Hmm.
iconic, and um,
Hmm.
yeah, became definitely something very special. But yeah, so in terms of original graphic novels, I did not read a lot of that when I was first reading comics, and like I've talked on the show before, I more or less stopped reading comics, like traditional comics. Um, just right as I got into high school, so around 14, 15, I was like, if it's not the Sandman, I don't care, and just totally was like, nothing other than Sandman. So of course I got every collected edition of Sandman that I could get at the time as it was being released, and of course have all the floppies up through 70. I guess it was 75 is the last issue of the Wake, around there, 70 something.
I always forget if it
But
went to 75 or 80 issues. I always forget.
it didn't go to 80,
Okay.
but it
Starman
was
went to
definitely
80. Starman
yeah,
went to 80. Okay.
yeah.
And
But
some other series went to 80. So for some reason, 80 is in my head because that seems to
yeah,
be a bellwether mark for many of those. Yeah.
especially around the
Yeah.
Vertigo stuff,
Yeah.
unless you were Hellblazer, in which case you
Yeah.
went to like 300 something.
Yeah.
Um, but when I got to college, I had the great fortune of actually being in a city that had a lot of great indie bookshops, and of course had a collection of European stores that would carry European comics and graphic novels and trades, as well as the American ones. And I came across in 1998, when I first moved to the city, the new collected edition of Cages by Dave McKean. Now, it's not an original graphic novel per se. It wasn't set. It originally came out in 6 issues throughout the 80s. It was actually published, I think, by 2 different publishers when it first came out. The first 3 issues were with one company that probably went under, as a lot of unfortunate indie publishers did in the 80s to early 90s, and then also Kitchen Sink Press, which published the final 3 issues of this, and then the final collected edition, the first collected edition, which just came out. So this is with Dave McKean, and of course it caught my eye because Dave McKean had done all of the covers for the Sandman series, and so of course I was already a fan of his artwork. And here's a book that he had completely done, from cover to cover. And his work, you can immediately, and I have to be very careful with this one because the spine has been read so many times, it's falling apart. But I mean, it's just very much his style, but he plays with all sorts of panel sizes. He plays with, the imagery. He plays with, white space and black space and all sorts of things in this beautiful inked book. And the plot is very difficult to explain. It involves three artists, different types of artists. One's an artist, musician, and a writer that live in an apartment building in London. And there are cats that see everything and hear everything and kind of connect them in certain ways. So their own little stories and their lives and their philosophical musings. There's a lot of dialogue here. It's kind of almost like listening to or reading Dave McKean basically put his own thoughts down to paper, just letting them run, kind of like an Alan Moore type, just like, let's just let it go. It's just a very unique story and very unique book, not to everybody's taste, but the way that this came out and the way that it was presented is just so gorgeous. And this is just one of those things where, if people want to, criticize and say, oh, well, collected editions and trades and things like that, especially in the 90s when this came out, can't really be impressive. And you can just throw this out and probably hit them with it because it does weigh about 6 pounds. But it's definitely something that to me got me back into indie comics big time. To see that something this beautiful could be put out and also contain a story that was just intriguing and wonderful and good for a pretentious college student and all of that stuff. And it's just a really amazing book, and really got me back into the indie comics, which for years those are the only kind I bought were original graphic novels, trades of indie stuff, until I got back into capes in 2011. So
okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very good transition into the next two that I'm going to talk about. And I think your experience where you leave comics alone when high school starts and then get back to them, for me, it was a definite stop in December 1980. I just stopped cold turkey. It was all music from that point on, and did not read
really.
anything. Yeah. Can you believe it? What would have led you to believe that was the case? But it was 1985, just at the tail end of high school when I started getting back into stuff and reading. But the following year was when we had Dark Knight Returns.
There you go.
Again, first in 4 prestige issues, and then it was collected in this edition that collected all 4 issues. I'm certain this is a first printing. Want to double check. First printing.
Ooh.
And you see it's not in pristine shape, and one of the reasons was this got lent out a lot in college. A lot of people like, oh, you have that, I've been meaning to read that. Here, somehow it got back to me, somehow, I still have it. Because this was read a lot. My roommate, who had not read a comic book since he was 9 years old, read this. Hi, Andy, if you're for watching. But this was a very big game changer in the 80s when you did have what we really truly know now as collected editions. That where there was a book that had some kind of marquee value, and you were able to extend the life of the book. Very often it would be limited to like an arc or a limited series. It wasn't until much later that you saw successive, and I think really Sandman might have been the big one with that, where it was not inconceivable that the entire series would be printed. But again, it's from the mind and pen of Frank Miller, game-changing book. Something that came very close to on its heels was the first collected edition of the material that was written for Swamp Thing by Alan Moore. This was a different experience for me because at the time Alan Moore was super hot as a writer, and his books, if they were sought after, were exceptionally hard to find. So this collected not his first issue, because the first issue of Saga of the Swamp Thing that he wrote kind of wrapped up all the loose ends, and I think even it's called Loose Ends or something. But it started with the first issue of the anatomy lesson, and again, it's a very monumental step for the character, where we think we've been dealing with Alec Holland this whole time, and he thinks he's Alec Holland, and it turns out he's not. That he is an elemental, and we go forward from there. It's some of my favorite bits in comic books ever in this story. The demons appearance and all the creepy stuff that surrounds Abby, and an appearance by the Justice League of America because of the machinations of the Floronic Man. And let me just get to this page because I just love this. Hold on, I'll get there. I should have bookmarked it. But all he has to say, all Alan Moore has to say, is this is where the Justice League gathers. Instead of saying Hawkman, Superman, and Flash, we have, there's a man with wings like a bird. There is a man who can see across the planet and wring diamonds from its anthracite. There is a man who moves so fast that his life is an endless gallery of statues. Fuck me. That's just like, that's the most amazing comic book writing up to that point, without a doubt, for me. You can see it's a bit battered, again, like The Dark Knight Returns. It got lent out a lot. But this was, I think, 87, and I have to see. First printing, yeah. But this also came out from Warner Books, and before there was delineation between bookstores and direct sales. There was more of a delineation, I should say. Warner Books took up the printing for this, and DC would do the comic retailers. Not a big deal. Still, just history there, folks. But again, from that golden age, I would say, of the mid '80s, when things went into a different gear for comic books. These were two examples, and very early examples of the collected editions as we know them. So,
well, funny that you should mention that, because one of the first trades I ever got that was a comic book trade was a collected edition, and I picked it up in, I want to say, like 91 maybe. And unfortunately, I know I have it somewhere. I can't find it. I still have it. I know I moved with it, but I've moved about, I don't know how many times since, probably a dozen. Since that original bedroom in Rhode Island where I picked it up. But it was the Spider-Man Saga of the Alien Costume, and I do have a picture of it, so I can share that. There we go. So this one, like, just a quick little image over here, Amazing Spider-Man over on that side. Basically, it was a really interesting collected edition. It didn't collect the whole alien suit saga. It basically stopped. It was really only Amazing Spider-Man 252 through 259. So it picks up right as Spider-Man's original suit, the red and blue suit, is destroyed on Battleworld during Secret Wars, and they print a new suit for him that's black and white, and it's that iconic black and white suit. And you're like, oh wow, that's really cool.
Little did they know.
Yeah. Exactly. It makes its own webbing. It can camouflage as like normal clothes. He never has to take it off. It knows what he's thinking, and kind of helps him out and stuff. Well, of course, he thinks this is pretty awesome. He comes back to Earth and then proceeds to do some usual New York City adventures. He fights against the mob boss, hobgoblins involved, some other guy, fights him. And also at this time, Mary Jane has her big bombshell reveal that she's known he's been Spider-Man the whole time. So Peter Parker at this point was still dating Mary Jane Watson. And thinking that he was leading this crazy double life, and I better hope that she never finds out who I really am. And duh, she's not an idiot. So of course she figures it out pretty early on. But this is the moment where she lets him know. And so that's involved in the story. So it's an interesting storyline. It goes for about 7-8 issues. But in the middle of it, that's where Peter starts realizing that the suit's doing some weird things. So he finds that he's waking up tired, and we do see in during the course of this collection that the suit is basically taking his sleeping body out at night to fight crime and do workouts and whatever, and then like depositing him in his bed. And of course he's like, well, I wake up and I'm always exhausted. Well, he kind of gets worried about this. He's also extra worried. I think Mary Jane actually mentions that he's, you smell like you've been sleeping in those clothes, because basically he's not taking the suit off at all. It's just camouflaging as his normal clothes. He just never takes it off. So he goes to Mr. Fantastic, who helps him out and lets him know, by the way, your suit's alive. It is a symbiote. It's been here the whole time, and it's trying to bond with you permanently. Our first true appearance of Venom, essentially, or what will become Venom. Basically the collection itself ends with him, thinking that he's completely destroyed the suit, by, getting some resonations from some big church bells that it disappears. He thinks the suit's dead and gone. So he's done. And that's the end of the collection. Now, in subsequent years, they actually did reprint all these comics again in a 2-volume series. So you get all these issues, Amazing Spider-Man 252 to 259, and then additional Web of Spider-Man, and a couple other, Marvel Team Up and some other issues, where it becomes very clear that this black suit is also trying to, get some traction on its own. And Eddie Brock is introduced, and or at least he is introduced to the suit that then binds with him and becomes Venom. Now Peter Parker did actually wear a black and white suit for like 4 or 5 years worth of comics afterwards, but that one was made of cloth and apparently given to him by Black Cat or something. But this is where it started. And so that was my real big introduction to Amazing Spider-Man. And after that, it was because of course they released it in 1991, and what happens just around that time is Venom's becoming extremely popular. Carnage is introduced just a couple of years after it, I think in like 1992, around that time, 92, 93. And you have a lot of the, the symbiote wars and things that are happening at that point. So of course there's a great introduction for Spider-Man comics for me. And I read it and reread it and reread it and reread it. So maybe it's just been worn to pieces, and that's why I can't find it. It's probably scattered somewhere, eaten by mice. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of like my first comic trade of multiple issues. In that one, I think it was Tom DeFalco was writing all that one. And you had Ron Frenez, Rick Lenardi, and then also Roger Stern, I think, was writing a couple issues. But so you had some pretty good names on that, getting to introduce the world to what eventually became Venom.
So the books that I have talked about so far were all Big Two properties, and I did want to reinforce, just like you with what you had with Dave McKean and some other stuff, that the very notion of there being availability in collected forms meant a hell of a lot to the independent world. And when I got back into the comics, that was, a particular time. So the first properties that I got into on an independent basis were Mage and the Rocketeer. But
Yep.
one that I got through collected, and I just checked, it's a first edition. Love and Rockets. You know, I always thought it was really interesting. Look, I'm even holding it nice. Like it's treasured.
Treasure.
When you look at history, rock and roll, in terms of time, was very much aligned with the Silver Age of comics. You know, the first rumblings were in the mid 50s, and at the same time as Elvis and Chuck Berry were the first issues of The Flash. So there's an alignment in time, but there's not an alignment in perspective. Maybe some comes later with trippy psychedelics and Dicko, but there really wasn't much, mainly because it was middle-aged men that were writing and drawing these comics. But Love and Rockets was the first comic book that was rock and roll as fuck. And the brothers Hernandez, created these timeless characters, Maggie and Hopi, and the inhabitants of Palomar with Loca, and just some really amazing stuff. And this book really knocked me out because it's not reader friendly. It's dense. If you can see some of that as time goes on, both brothers, started adhering to a bit more, they welcome deconstruction a little bit more. So the early Love and Rockets are like remarkably dense, but remarkably powerful stuff. And, this is an independent book that I don't know if I ever would have gotten to it in the early stages as I did, because of the availability of it collected in trade. And I think this is the first 3 issues. At the very least, the covers for the first 2 are reprinted in here. And again, because they're so dense, it's like you don't know where things begin and when things end. But if you've never sampled Love and Rockets, please do so. It might not be your cuppa, but I think anybody can appreciate that it was a landmark series in reading the early issues. And, certainly was an eye-opener for me in terms of, because in some ways, for someone who I just said, was really into music at that time, this fed me, scratching the itch, a particular itch that certainly other comics didn't.
That's pretty cool. And what's really interesting, also speaking about sort of independent comics that that really have the ability to bring together, in a collected form, comics that are just almost impossible to find elsewhere. During the 70s and early 80s, you had so many indie books that if you didn't troll the right comic shop, because you had to have a direct market comic shop. You couldn't just like walk to the 7-Eleven and oh look, here's a bunch of Love and Rockets, or like, oh look, here's here's some comics with an X. Like most places you're not going to find that. If you're in a big city, if you're in like a very big West Coast US city, you might come across something like that in certain stores and bookstores. But a lot of times they're going to be harder to come by, especially if you're in middle America. If you're not, you're in the South. If you're not in New York City or LA or San Francisco, most likely you're not going to have been exposed to a lot of these individual issues. And so getting a collected edition that has a wider distribution can go into, bookstores all across the country, or at least be, more easily ordered and encountered, I think is extremely important. And I think that really kind of speaks to, a book like Mouse. And I'm going to bring this up. And here's volume 2 as well. But I'm going to bring up volume 1, the first collection of Mouse, because essentially it started as a collection of different, shorter pieces that Art Spiegelman did and published, on his own or in anthologies or collections with other, indie comics,
even newspapers. Some of that material
papers, all sorts of things that were ways that comic artists, underground comic artists, and indie comic artists were able to get their stories out there. But again, it wasn't for a major, national audience. You're going to have a hard time in 1982 finding a lot of Art Spiegelman around. If you're just going to the mall or going to your local bookshop or even to a local comic shop, you might not see anything from him unless somebody collected some zines or, had some stuff reprinted. But Mouse kind of put him on the map in a national context and also in a very literary context. So people took this for exactly what it was, and that is a collection of a very personal story, a personal history of his grandparents and or his parents, sorry, in the during World War II, during the Holocaust, but also his own struggles and his own issues. Living as a relatively privileged person who didn't have to suffer in that same way in the US, but also suffered from his own personal psychological demons. And this got a lot of national attention. This got actually on a lot of book lists. This got, I think he was nominated and then won a Pulitzer for the collected work, I think in 1992. But, this really was such a major milestone for comics as a whole, for I think adding some additional clout and seriousness. Like, this is a serious art form. We read Mouse in my freshman year of high school. This was something that was on our syllabus for my 9th grade English course.
Wow.
For 13, 14-year-old me, and it was fantastic. It was just a wonderful book to read. And obviously part 2 did come out a little bit later, but it was out by the time I was reading Mouse. That wraps everything up, and it was actually created a lot later, so it took him a little bit longer to complete the story that he had started way back in the 70s, essentially, for Mouse 1. But I mean, something like this, and it's still being read. It's being read in public schools. It's being, read in college syllabi. It's definitely part of canon now in many places. I'm not going to say everywhere, but many places nationally. But it's also something that people who tend to turn up their nose.
And it is in curriculum. It is in curriculum in both for literature and for history.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important note to make, and I think that's why it has such a, I don't want to say a broad appeal, but there is a very wide cast that the book, a very wide shadow that the book casts over topics that can be discussed certainly vigorously in an academic sense. Yeah.
Definitely. And so for somebody who's just looking for a book about that era, somebody who's looking for a more personal story, don't need to look at the big social issues. I mean, this is just as intimate a portrait of suffering, in a historical context, but also in a very personal context. The author puts his own pain in every page as well. And there you go. There's a graphic novel. Like a lot of young people in the 90s, this could have been their exposure. People who don't read comics or who will think of themselves as non-comic readers, in many cases were reading this because it was assigned to them. And so to have something like that where, most people can complain and say, comics aren't for me. It's like, well, probably read some and you've probably been impacted by them as well. And having something like that is definitely excellent for a first graphic novel for a lot of people, and sometimes it might be the only graphic novel a lot of people read, but at least here in the US.
Well, we covered a good spread. I do think in terms of books that very often might get the first graphic novel mantle for somebody, I do think that there are 3 more that we should mention. One that we did briefly when we were covering topics, and of course, Watchmen. And I think, and I do think for Watchmen, first print over there. I do think for Watchmen, I think there was a particular type of reader that can't conceive of that being issued in successive 12 issues. They definitely do see that as a whole from from the get-go. But I think very often you will see people, quote Watchmen as their earliest graphic novel because of the climate that we are in right now. I think The Walking Dead first volume, I think, is very often a suspect, I think, in terms of books that people would have hit first. And the other one that I think we should mention is Bone. That I do think, which is kind of, I've always, I know this sounds crazy, but I've always seen that as kind of, in some ways, a cousin to Mouse, not in terms of what is being discussed, but in terms of just in terms of the perspective from a business standpoint of something that is so far removed for superheroes that only works in graphic comic form. And I hope that makes some kind of sense, because there's a reason why we haven't had a Bone animated film right now, because there's something about it that just doesn't the right creator hasn't gotten his hands on it yet, and what's there is so valuable that I don't know. It's just, I've always seen that as that Bone should be mentioned in the same context as some other works that are not essentially Bone is an all ages book. I know there's been some redrawings of stuff, so it wasn't as problematic for some images, but it's an all ages book, and I do think all ages books sometimes get the short shrift in certain contexts.
Speaking of being an all ages book, I know people who were young in school and still had the monthly Scholastic flyer. There are obviously a lot of Scholastic printings that a lot of them got, and possibly elementary school, and then of course at book fairs and things like that. A lot of young people were exposed very early to having the opportunity to get Bone in a collected form.
Yep.
So being able to pick the entire Bone tome up, and it is thick. Most of the printings that we've seen are thick. But I mean, a lot of people, that was their first, and to this day remains probably their favorite graphic novel, long form graphic novel or long form collection of comics. And I mean, there's definitely nothing disappointing about that, for sure. We do have a quick comment here from James Figueroa, actually two. First one talking about Alan Moore's collected books. Miracle Man collections were possible to find even before all of the Wright shenanigans, and of course that's you could have a whole show on that one.
And there's some very unique situations to Miracle Man, principally the publisher going out of business and losing a lot of their stock in a flood. So I do think with Miracle Man, as he said, there were rights issues. I never got the collected versions from Marvel. I ended up getting the single issues. I have a good amount of the Eclipse stuff. Maybe you like this. Is coming out from Fantagraphics. Oh, nice. Yep.
So Jaime Hernandez does have a new book coming out from Fantagraphics in August called Queen of the Ring Wrestling Drawings. I am going to assume that it has something to do with women who wrestle.
Hey, we're on Thursday night. It's Dark Side night, so I guess
it is.
we
Dark Side of the 90s. Dark Side of the 90s. So, which
it's Dark Side night. Jesus.
Football's back in the fall.
I'm taping it right now. It's Teen TV and the emergence of Fox and 90210 and Melrose Place. It's tonight.
I mean, that might just be my Wolf of the Week. I don't know.
It could be. Mine's different, though. My Wolf of the Week's different. And I guess you just provided a bridge, so why don't we do it? When we wrap an episode of the Comic Book Bears podcast up, we do so with a segment we call the Woofs of the Week segment. In the bear community, when you find a fellow attractive, you woof at him, and we do something very similar here, where we pay some kind of tribute to something that may be a comic book, but it may also be a film or a TV program or a charitable initiative, anything under the sun that we think you, fair listener or viewer, may be interested in sampling. So, Steve, you're one of two. I'll start with you. What is your Wolf of the Week?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of us to choose from tonight. My Wolf of the Week is, as I just mentioned, Dark Side of the 90s. Now, I've talked about Dark Side of Wrestling before. That is an excellent series. Dark Side of Football, which I surprisingly also enjoyed, even though I'm not a big football guy. But their latest is Dark Side of the 90s. And it's put out by Vice, and from the same producers, obviously, the other two Dark Side series. But this one looks at topics that maybe not necessarily were born in the 90s, but impacted the 90s very, very strongly. I'm not even going to mention, Woodstock 99, but they did talk the first two episodes on some very important topics. One, talk shows, the rise of the talk show in the 90s, the Jerry Springers, Maury Povich, there's just tons of them, Jenny Jones, et cetera, and the impact that had on television as a whole, but also on the culture and the perception of reality TV, because that really is the true origin of reality TV, and all the craziness that comes with it. And then the second episode was, I think, probably one of the more moving short episodes that I've seen in a long time, and that's the history of the Viper Room, which is famously Johnny Depp's club, where River Phoenix died. Something we talked about several months ago when we covered I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, that played very heavily into that. So if you have a chance to check it out, it is on, I believe, Viceland, but also if you have the Discovery Plus app, you can eventually you can see the episodes. You can go back and see all the Dark Side of Wrestling, Dark Side of Football episodes. And I think it's also on Hulu, so you may be able to see some reruns on demand on Hulu for Dark Side of the 90s, wrestling and football.
Okay. I am a football fan, and I had a good week. And I think ESPN has their sequel to The Last Dance coming up. But my Wolf of the Week, initially I was toying with the Woodstock 99 documentary, and I was toying with some other things that had come out. But the most emotionally charged material that I came across this week, this was something else that I got in the Hamilton sale, and this is Becoming Superman, and this is the autobiography of J. Michael Straczynski. Joe, as he's known, is probably best known for creating Babylon 5 and has a long history in film and television and comic books. Received an Academy Award nomination for writing the screenplay of Changeling and some other things. And he does have a reputation of not playing well with others in comic books. It doesn't seem to be as prevalent in relation to his work in television. But you read this book and, man, this guy went through hell as a child. It's really a gut-wrenching read. Also because he is from North Jersey, but from a different section of North Jersey than I'm from. There were this familiarity with the locales, not the locales as he knew him in the time that he grew up, because there's an age difference between the two of us. He's significantly older, but I gotta say, man, this was a really rough read. I haven't gotten through this yet. I'm about a third of the way through. The blurb on the front says, "My journey from poverty to Hollywood with stops along the way at murder, madness, mayhem, movie stars, cults, slums, sociopaths, and war crimes." I've covered about half of those topics yet. I can't wait to get to the cults and the murder.
Yay, cults.
Yay, murder. But what I've read through it's been tough to read. And, I was reading this poolside with, neighbors, and, there are various points where I'm reading and I'm just like, pulling some of those. and it really is an arresting read, and it's a book I have to finish. Let's put it that way. So that's my wolf of the week, Becoming Superman. And that this is a plug for HamiltonBooks.com, but if you want to get it on the inexpensive side, that may be a mechanism. So
cool.
There you go. All right, I guess we can wrap this one up. Again, we are the Comic Book Bears podcast. You can find us on the Twitter and the Tumblr and the Instagram as Comic Book Bears. You can find us on the Facebook as Comic Book Bears Podcast. If you want to write to us, please do so by sending an email to comicbookbears@gmail.com. And if you want to listen to us, experience us through the audio or visual realm, you can listen to us through iTunes, download us through actually, let's flip that. Download us through iTunes, listen to us through Stitcher Radio, or catch us on some of the other podcatching platforms. If you're seeing this, it may be through the Facebook system. If not, these episodes are archived on YouTube, and please do like our YouTube channel and leave a review, because that is all greatly appreciated, especially as it is still, despite Delta, it looks like we're con season, and I guess we can announce we're press at one of the upcoming cons, so we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail, because there may be some more substantial involvement with the proceedings, but we're going to be seeing each other come October. It's amazing. It's
yay.
Yay. Might have masks on our face, but that's okay. We'll see. We may have to flash our cards, but that's okay. That's okay. We'll be around people that are like us, and the rest of them can turn around and get disappointed and infect each other. You go do that. Okay.
Go infect amongst yourselves.
Yeah, just go do that. If you're not gonna contribute, remove yourself from the equation. That's the way to do it. So
super spread yourself elsewhere.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, we're the Comic Book Bears, and we will see you next time. Until then, I'm Bill Zanowitz.
And I'm Steve Morey.
You're going to hear a wolf and an explosion. We'll be back real soon. Take care, everyone.